everybody. Welcome to episode 200 of the Catholic Culture Podcast. Now, since it's episode 200, I hope you'll allow me a somewhat longer intro than normal. Today's episode is on a topic that might be somewhat controversial, even though the purpose of this discussion is not to upset people, but to begin a conversation about a significant problem that affects the ability of Catholic married couples to grow in holiness. Now, my guest and I would both contend that the popular presentation of natural family planning does not adequately reflect the Church's perennial teachings on the purpose of marital relations, sexual asceticism, and the good of continence. We fully affirm the magisterial teachings on NFP and its legitimate use under certain circumstances, but due to widespread ignorance of certain points of Catholic teaching, the way NFP is commonly taught at the level of marriage prep and by popular speakers and authors ends up in practice encouraging couples towards habitual venial sin. Now, my guest today, Eamonn Clark, has written an outstanding, groundbreaking study of this topic titled New Questions, Old Answers, Catholic Morals and Natural Family Planning. Eamonn defends in his book, he defends NFP against accusations that it's tantamount to contraception, but he also argues, based on Catholic teaching, that there are specific moral limits to the legitimate use of marital relations while deliberately trying to avoid conception. I would say his conclusions occupy kind of a middle ground between the extremely strict position of some great Catholic authorities of the past and the laxity and sensualism presented even by some well-regarded and well-meaning popular speakers today. And ultimately, I think that he shares this middle ground with the magisterium of the Church. Now, many, perhaps even most listeners will find this discussion somewhat spiritually challenging simply because some of the Church's traditional teaching on sexual morality is basically never heard today. But I would encourage you to push through your discomfort if you are uncomfortable and keep listening, because even if you end up disagreeing with some of the specific conclusions Eamonn reaches in his book, and these are, as he acknowledges, matters that can be debated in good faith by Catholics to some extent, still, you're going to learn about some important Church teachings you may not have heard before, and this will equip you with tools to consider for yourself how you can seek greater holiness in marriage, or if you're unmarried, it might help you to make a more informed choice about your state in life. And in particular, I would highly recommend Eamonn's book to anyone who is involved in running marriage prep programs. Okay, so to introduce him, Eamonn Clark is a licensed moral theologian of the Catholic Church. He has an STB and STL from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, where he is currently a lay doctoral student researching the social teaching of Pope Pius XI. Eamonn, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Great to be here.
Okay, well, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just wanted to ask, your doctorate that you're working on is on Pope Pius XI's social teaching. Now, this isn't totally off topic, right? Because Pius XI wrote this great encyclical on marriage that everybody should read, Casti Connubii, and it does touch on things that are, pertinent to this topic, right? But how did you end up writing this book all about the ethics of NFP?
Yeah, so the doctorate is actually on Quadragesimo Anno, which is Pius XI's great social encyclical. Like, it's a per se social encyclical.
Right.
40 years after Rerum Novarum. It sort of starts the tradition of commenting on Rerum Novarum. And I'm actually looking at the phrase social justice. That's the encyclical that popularizes that phrase. And there's a whole very interesting history of that phrase before that encyclical. And I'm sort of searching that out. And it goes into, Rosmini, Tapparelli, and then silently through Leo the 13th, who was a seminarian under Tapparelli, and then into Pius XI's world. He was taught by Father Liberatore, who was a close collaborator with Tapparelli, who was co-founder of La Civiltà Cattolica under Pius IX. Anyway, it's looking at all that. But that's given me sort of a sense for Pius XI's stuff in particular. And I've done a lot of archival work on Pius XI. Like, I have a really good sense of what that stuff is like, including having had my hands on some of the draft materials for Casti Connubii
Wow,
in
that's
the
awesome.
Jesuit archives, and other interesting things like that. And then, so you asked about the NFP book. How did it come about? I actually started a conference at the Angelicum for students to present theological topics, in sort of a closed environment, not a public conference. And I was presenting a paper at my own conference, uh, and it was on what would St. Thomas think of natural family planning. And I kind of put together a basic presentation, and I started to see there's something really interesting here that you don't really get in the course of seminary formation or a normal ecclesiastical theological course on marriage and family issues. And I just kept pulling that thread after the talk, and it turned into what I wanted to be a journal article, and then eventually that grew into the book that I'm releasing now.
Great, great. And by the time this podcast is out, the book will also be out. So if you want to quickly explain how people can actually get the book, you might as well say that now, I guess.
Well, I suppose we could put a link in the description
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
the page on the website of my company, and you can just download it there. And maybe put your email address into the form, and then I'll send you the book.
Right. And this is a relatively short, it's like 70 something pages. So not a super long book, but definitely worthwhile. Okay. So I already kind of introduced this topic in a very general way. But do you have anything more to say by way of introduction to like what's the particular problem that you wanted to address in this work?
Everyone complains about the Spirit of Vatican II, right? Um, I think there's also something that we might call the spirit of the theology of the body. The Spirit of Vatican II, this is an ideological hijacking of the Second Vatican Council using maybe some proof texts, like a line or two from this or that document, to sort of put together something that's pretty detached from the texts themselves, in liturgy or in morals or ecclesiology, whatever you like. I think there's something that's true, at least to some extent, um, about the same kind of phrase being applied to the reaction to John Paul II's catecheses on marriage and family, commonly referred to as the theology of the body,
Right.
which is a series of Wednesday
Maybe not a
audience he
deliberate
gave.
hijacking, but like still
not
kind
not
of a,
necessarily
a
as
sloppy
deliberate
reading.
as, yeah, it's different. It's definitely a different thing, and I want to be cautious. I'm not accusing people of being quite as, let's say, activistic as certain clerics were in the late 1960s and early 70s, and certainly not you know um, touching anything directly sacrilegious or anything like this.
Right.
It's more that it conveys the general sense of a detachment from the source texts themselves in view of other ideas that they might be importing into their project.
Right. And part of that is, maybe a sloppy reading of the theology of the body itself. A part of it is a lack of awareness of the context, of John Paul II's own formation, perhaps his own views on sexual morality that are just sort of basic points of church teaching, that people are not kind of thinking about. And so it leads them to take it in a direction that would not have been intended.
I'll add to that in one of the footnotes I cite, or allude to, I think Father Thomas Petrie, OP's book on John Paul II's anthropology is founded in St. Thomas, or rooted in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. So
Right.
John Paul II sort of takes for granted a lot of things that people may not be aware of necessarily.
Well, this is a common theme too. Before we started recording, I was talking about his sort of philosophical magnum opus, Person and Act, and the original translation of that. It's well known, basically like botched and removed a lot of the Latin terms and explicit references to Saint Thomas, and so people had the impression that it was a much less Thomistically contextualized work than it actually is. And the more recent translation from Catholic University of America Press, which came out a few years ago, restores all of that. So now people can sort of understand how even when he is doing something that is sort of directly in the phenomenological context, it's actually all with Thomistic presuppositions about objective reality, about being and
Yeah.
such. So, yeah. So, There's also there's another aspect too, which is like, okay, so if part of the problem is, a lack of keeping theology of the body in its proper context, and your book is not primarily about, referring back to the text of theology of the body, but more about recovering that context for it. That raises questions about the current state of Catholic sexual ethics, which you discuss a bit at the beginning of the book, which is, how do we sort of end up with a situation where I guess you could say we've got a situation where, and this is true of so many things in the church, where the church is trying to hold the line on things that are like a matter of mortal sin, and it's hard enough to do that today, that things that are maybe a matter of venial sin or a matter of spiritual perfection just get totally lost in the mix. Would you say that's a good characterization?
Absolutely. And I feel, at first, for all of the marriage preparation coordinators who are watching this, and no doubt, like getting ready to, have their fists up, like, thank you for your work and for trying to introduce couples just to the barest minimum standards of morals. It's really difficult work. It's very challenging. It's challenging just to get people, not to use contraception, not to, believe in abortion, to believe in the most basic things that only men and women can marry. You may have a lot of couples walking in who don't believe that. And I want to stress that I'm aware of the pastoral difficulty and complexity with just proposing the most basic stuff. It's not the 1870s anymore. You can't just presume that couples know what marriage is. So you have to teach them in, like, 3 or 4 sessions of an hour and a half. Like, it's really difficult. So uh, thank you for your work. And I guess my book is sort of a challenge to what could be beyond that. It's in some way aspirational, but I do think there are couples that you'll find in your marriage prep courses who are like, well, like, what else is out there? We get the basic stuff, but do you have anything more? And so I put in the end of the book even a very short discussion of the gifts and the fruits and the beatitudes. These are things that we don't talk about. Like, have you ever heard of anyone in marriage preparation talking about, the life of the spirit and the gifts and the fruits and infused temperance? And well, no, like, you can't get there with most people.
Right.
Like, for numerous reasons, you can't get there. But that doesn't mean that we can't get there with some couples who really are looking for that. And so this book is sort of a way to help them, especially.
Well, and the fact is that, in order to make an informed decision on how to be pastoral, you have to have all the doctrinal data before you. And I don't know that some of the things we're going to discuss just on a doctrinal level, like I said, are not well known. Now, some of it is you're putting forth a theological opinion that is well grounded, but as you acknowledge, is something that's up for debate in certain respects. But some of the basic points, one of the challenges of making this argument that you're making is that even some of the basic points of doctrine that sort of lay the foundation for your view on NFP specifically are just not really well known anymore.
Yes, like Innocent XI's bull in 1679, right? Which used to be printed in the front of, moral theology handbooks, and now, no one knows who Innocent XI was. So that's a
Right.
good example.
Yeah. Okay, and one more question about the current state. You mentioned Spirit of the Theology of the Body. I don't want to name names here, but do you have any sort of examples of like questionable or bad advice that is sort of confidently given by, chastity speakers, theology of the body speakers, whatever, or just sort of generally out there in the air without necessarily being attributable to any one person, that is kind of the kind of thing that you're trying to rectify here?
With the book itself, the main gist of the book is, there's one or two examples I could give that would be very precise. But with the book itself, it's cutting against, I guess, the sort of thought that, well, more is better. And the marriage act's actually spiritual act, when this is not part of basic Christian anthropology and ascetical theology. This is not a spiritual act; it's a biological act. And the spirit is impeded from moving in the soul Prophets don't prophesy during the marriage act. You can read, St. Thomas and Gratian and all of these older sources just kind of laying this out. And so I guess
Which isn't
the
to say that
main
it can't be
thing.
a virtuous act or,
No,
an
no,
act that
absolutely
where
not.
grace is,
But not a
involved.
spiritual act. And the sense you get from some authors and speakers is that, you're engaging in a spiritual act, this spiritual encounter. It's not. It's an emotional, psychologically cathartic encounter, ideally at least, and it's a biological encounter, a physical encounter.
By spiritual, you mean obviously these are spiritual persons, they're acting, so it's all acts are spiritual in that sense. But what you're saying is that like it's not this sort of mystical, high flown kind of.
Right. Right. It's not an encounter with the Holy Spirit, moving extraordinarily in the soul, in under infused temperance or by the motion within a gift, or it's not a fruit and certainly not a beatitude. And these are the spiritual acts, right? This is why knowing what the gifts and fruits are is important. After confirmation class, you should actually go and learn, what
Hmm.
these things really are. And the point of Christian life is actually the Beatitudes, to live the Beatitudes. These are the most perfect acts we can do. So it's not a contemplative act. It's not an act of prayer, and it's not a gift being filled by the Holy Spirit. It's not a fruit. It's not a beatitude. That's basically what I mean. But the sense one gets from certain speakers is that, well, more is better because this is a spiritual thing. You're doing something spiritual that's moving you closer to God. You may be moving closer to God because of the moral import of the act itself, but not because it's spiritual. That's sort of the
Right.
gist that I'm trying
So
to move
so
against.
what you're saying is that some theology of the body people place an undue emphasis on the sexual act itself as kind of like the spiritual center of marital spirituality.
Married life, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where,
And
for
the
instance,
spiritual center of married life is imaging Christ in the church in selfless self-giving and service through, sacrifice and contemplation, which is the poles of human fulfillment, right?
right.
A part of which would include, the marriage act in various ways, but really it's about rational love and contemplation of one's spouse and pouring oneself out for their sake, however
Right.
that may be.
Which is why, since the very early church, it's been considered a very admirable, though certainly not obligatory thing for married couples to practice continence after their childbearing years are over. I mean, you see this a lot in letters by Saint Jerome to his friends who are also saints, encouraging them to
Yeah,
do that or praising them for having done that.
yeah, yeah. And Saint Jerome
Yeah.
was really concerned to protect marriage from the Jovinian, and the he was very interested in marriage. He's someone worth reading.
I think maybe what we should do is just give a brief statement of kind of the position you're arguing for in the book, and then we can sort of set up some of the preliminaries for that, and then sort of come work our way back to that step by step. Does that sound good?
Sure. Yeah. In short, what I'm trying to present in the book is a fundamental answer to two interrelated questions. The first question is, what is a just cause for spacing births, for avoiding having children to begin with? Okay, so that's question number one, right? And then the second question is, and this is the one that really is the zinger, is what is the motivation for using the Marriage Act, which is a euphemism, okay, for conjugal relations? What is the motivation for this particular use of marriage, as it were? Those are the two questions, and I think in the book I work backwards. So I take the second question first, and St. Thomas and St. Augustine say that there are only two licit motivations to use marriage: to have children or to pay the marriage debt. So if the spouse requests the marriage act under normal circumstances, within reason, one is bound to pay the marriage debt. Um, and that's it for them. That's it. Okay. If it's something other than that, it's excessive. It's an improper use of the marriage act. Interestingly, they don't consider the question, to my knowledge, of whether consummating the marriage suffices as a motive to use marriage. They don't actually broach that question, which maybe they should have, because it would correspond to the good of the sacrament. Um, Whereas the one motive, paying the debt, refers to fidelity or faith, which is to ease concupiscence, right, of the spouse, who should control themselves by other means, but they can't, and so this is by concession. This is what St. Thomas and St. Augustine give as a reading of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:6. And then the other good is children, which of course the procreation of children is a legitimate motive for the Marriage Act. St. Alphonsus disagrees with them. Okay, and the bulk of the moral tradition after Saint Alphonsus, it's sort of dropped somewhere in between Saint Thomas and Saint Alphonsus, and I want to do a little bit more work, or maybe a lot more work, and finding exactly where that happens. There's some authors who sort of move against it. Dennis the Carthusian, who I know you had a podcast recently talking about Dennis. He sort of is a little bit moving in a different direction, maybe indirectly. Haven't really gotten into Antoninus of Florence. Um, but anyway, there are other authors in between who sort of start to maybe clear the path for that position, which is taken up by Busenbaum. Hermann Busenbaum is the author that St. Alphonsus bases his moral theology around, his text of moral theology. It's kind of extended commentary on Busenbaum's manual. And Alphonsus uh, basically says, with Busenbaum, to pay the debt, to have children, and also to ease concupiscence, or the desire for the use of marriage, which is not otherwise reasonably relieved. And that's a big, big change in attitudes or approaches between the Augustinian Thomistic line and then St. Alphonsus and sort of the tradition after him. So that's the first question, is I'm arguing in favor of Alphonsus.
The import of what that change, which associated with Saint Alphonsus and seemingly adopted by the magisterium of the church significantly, is that it would not be a venial sin for the spouse who requests the marriage debt. Whereas before, under St. Thomas and St. Augustine, it was this much more strict view that if your spouse asks for the marriage debt, you're bound to pay it so that he will avoid sinning in some other way. But for him to request it would be a fault, would be a venial sin. Whereas
Right.
St. Alphonsus says, no, this is a normal part of marriage.
Right. Yeah, and it's now essentially adopted, I guess, by silence by the magisterium, by not contradicting this opinion, which is sort of very, it's the mainline opinion, after Alphonsus, at least it seems to me.
Right.
Um, but yeah, for St. Thomas, no, it's a superfluity. It's an excessive desire for carnal union. Proceeds from a kind of lust, but it's better, or it's less bad, if it's done to avoid sin than for mere pleasure. So he makes that distinction, which is a distinction which is something I talk about in the book.
Sure, sure. And so where do you take this with your argument then?
Right. So another critical text is Innocent XI's bull Sanctissimus Dominus from 1679, who condemns as not allowable opinion, let's say, um, uh, the idea that the use of marriage for pleasure alone is void of all venial guilt and defect. This is a condemned proposition. And so when St. Thomas talks about to avoid sin or for mere pleasure, that's where that becomes really relevant. And there's a whole complicated history and reaction to Innocent XI's doctrine, which I get into a little bit in the book. But that distinction between avoiding sin in oneself, or at least avoiding distracting concupiscence, and I elaborate a little bit, but within modesty, in the book, you know, that seems to be an acceptable reason to request the marriage debt. Whereas mere pleasure, And it's difficult to define that. It's another ambition and a part of the book is to kind of explain what that means. Mere pleasure does not suffice in Alphonse's opinion or in my opinion. So that's sort of where that goes in the book.
So, and just for the listeners' sake, that is one of those areas that's definitely not a matter of opinion. So, the view that of Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, that requesting the marital debt for any reason other than, procreation would be a venial sin is a matter of opinion, and as you just said, one that has sort of been dropped by the tradition. However, not just Pope Innocent XI, but any father or doctor of the church who ever commented on this topic would say that it is sinful, venially, for a married couple to have relations purely for the purpose of pleasure.
Right.
And then the sort of I don't know if I should get into this now, but we also do have an actual magisterial teaching that says that other motives are allowed to be considered as secondary. Pius XI says this in Casti Connubii, right? That other motives such as, I don't remember the list, but, health, the strengthening of the marriage bond, mutual aid, those things are able to be considered as long as they are subordinated to the primary end of marriage. Those things can't be considered in isolation from those primary ends, but they can be considered as sort of your subjective motivations. In other words, it's not sinful to be motivated by emotional bonding with my spouse. Right. So that also maybe complicates it somewhat, but also sort of
It definitely complicates it.
But it also
Takes up
but it also is a source of relief, I think, very important for anybody who might be tempted to become very neurotic and scrupulous about this whole thing, because it's not that you can't consider other motivations, and that those motivations cannot exclude the primary ends of marriage, right?
Yeah, and kind of the most challenging point in this regard, which is buried in page 57 or whatever. Um, I don't know the page number. Don't it's in there. It's and this is the point where I'm actually hoping that people can find good arguments to respond to this and oppose me on this. But the argument ultimately is that um, if one is not seeking one of those three goods, and with the possible exception of the consummation of marriage, and kind of leaving that aside,
Sure.
procreation to pay the debts or to ease concupiscence that is not otherwise reasonably relieved. That third one being the one we're really considering here. It, outside of those three motives, one should do something other than the marriage act to pursue those other ends. Marital bonding or expression of affection or health. Go for a jog. Um, whatever it might be. It's really that third point that needs to be considered honestly. Do I really need this? And in the background, which probably some viewers are really confused. Why is this an issue at all? The fundamental anthropological principle, which animates this part of ascetical theology, is that the use of reason is good, and it's in fact so good that we are bound to keep it unless there is something that suffices for removing it. Right? This is why drunkenness is a sin. It's why drugs are sinful. You remove the use of your reason. In the marriage act, the pleasures are so intense that your reason is either strongly inhibited or entirely removed from its act. That's the thing that's going on underneath of this, and it's got to be made clear that that's the issue for St. Thomas, and he talks about this in the Summa or in the Supplementum. That's the thing that's going on underneath of this conversation. Why are you removing the use of your reason? That's what's at issue.
There has to be a good reason. So why What if somebody objects? Well, that's totally different from drugs and drunkenness. This is a natural function of how we were made. So clearly, God intended us to. If that's how we were made, or maybe maybe it's an inescapable effect of the fall, and that wouldn't happen before the fall. That's probably more likely, right? But if people were to say, well, that's just a totally illegitimate comparison because drugs and drunkenness are not part of our basic biological functioning. Like this is more like sleep or something like that.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, we can use drugs sometimes, like anesthesia, right? Um, and this is a good thing. God made those things too, right?
Hmm.
And so it's a matter of proportion between, the reason why you are inhibiting your mental faculties and the good that you're pursuing. And the tradition the tradition has sort of ruled that, these are the things which excuse it, and other things do not. There's plenty of debate in the authors about whether health by itself would excuse the marriage act, or maybe to settle a dispute, or for honor, or the good of the act itself. This is one of the weirder opinions put forward by Sanchez, who's kind of like the classical master. The act itself excuses the act. It's kind of a weird um, argument. I don't really get into it too much in the book, but there's plenty of debate about this in the authorities. What's clear is that to pay the debt suffices, children suffice, and at least after Alphonsus, the easing of one's concupiscence that's not otherwise easily treated, that suffices. I'm trying to just apply the Alphonsian doctrine to our current situation, where we now know about the cyclical nature of female fertility, whereas back then we actually did not know that, not really, which is a pretty surprising thing. It's only the 1840s that we really start to understand the predictability of the female cycle. But no, I mean, you can remove your reason for a sufficient motive, and the judgment is what really suffices for that, and is it better pursued another way? That's the key. And there's plenty to talk about, but maybe I'll just leave it there.
So when we use that language of excusing the marriage act, it's we want to be careful here because that word excuse is not because the act is bad. The act is good.
Yeah, just good.
Um, but it's that specific aspect of losing your reason. And
Yes.
as you say in the book, kind of like indulging in the most intense pleasures available, even if you didn't lose your reason, it does kind of habituate you to a more sensual life, let's say, like a life that's
Yes.
more oriented towards sense pleasure, which is why even setting aside the question of sin or anything that might be sinful, um, would it be right to say that this is the primary reason why celibacy, the primary moral reason, let's say, as opposed to theological, symbolic reason that celibacy is seen as higher than marriage, sexual activity?
Yeah, the ascetical tradition is vast, and you can read the great authors on this. But my brief synthesis is that abstaining from marriage, and especially the marriage act, and those are distinct things, but removing oneself from very intense pleasures is freeing to the mind, because we are we are flesh and blood, and if we use pleasures too much, we're drawn towards them kind of due to the fall and our bodily nature. Whereas, stepping away from them, mortifying the flesh, we're attacking one of the three roots of sin: the world, the flesh, the devil. And we have corresponding evangelical counsels of chastity, poverty, and obedience, right, on the way towards Christian perfection. So this is the kind of thing that abstinence or continence does. Is it frees the mind for the pursuit of spiritual things, and especially if one is sinning against the sixth commandment, one's spiritual senses become very, very dull. And if you talk to someone who's living a life of sin, you'll probably pick up on that pretty quickly. They don't understand the idea of heaven. They don't understand the idea of prayer. They can't really perceive the good of virtue. something's in their mind that's blocking their access to that world. So they're missing an interior light, which would be turned on if they were to stop sin and even withdraw themselves more and more from the use of even lawful pleasures.
Right.
Um,
And so, what's true of obviously mortal sins of mortal sins in general, mortal sins of the flesh in darkening our understanding is true to a lesser but still significant extent with, say, habitual venial sins
yes,
as well. And also just the basic psychology, physiology of pursuit, even of lawful pleasures, as you just said, when
yeah,
this is not restrained, and that is part of the data of revelation. Again, that's another area that's not a matter of opinion, as we have this in St. Paul. I don't remember exactly where, but the idea of ceasing relations by mutual consent for a time of prayer. Well,
yeah. It's
why would
First
those things?
Corinthians.
Why would those
Yeah,
things be related at all if abstaining from those pleasures was not helpful
right.
spiritually?
Right. We have
Um,
the whole ascetical tradition backs this up, even back to Moses, right? God is coming down on Sinai. Men, do not have relations with your wives. Something holy is going to happen. It's not that sex is bad. It's that you need to be free in your mind, right? There's a ritual purity thing going on there as well, perhaps, but also your mental faculties need to be withdrawn from attention to worldly things. And the best way to do that is to abstain from the most intense pleasures.
and that
That's the basic
manifested
idea.
itself in previous church disciplines about having married couples being forbidden to have relation on certain kinds of holy days during
Absolutely.
Lent, other penitential
3 days
seasons,
before communion. Yeah.
3 days before communion. Yeah, wow. So we talked a bit about your sort of your second major opinion about the use of marriage, and just to sort of like put a point on that, the point is that in the normal course of marriage, when the primary ends of marriage and the sort of extrinsic ends of the marriage act, procreation, the marital debt, relief of concupiscence, are considered, as Pius XI says, there's these other secondary motives that are legitimately motivating you, right? However, that range of acceptable motivations narrows in the context where you are specifically trying to avoid the primary intrinsic end of the marriage act, which is procreation. At that point, there's certain limits that are placed, greater limits that are placed on your allowable ability to just indulge freely in marital relations. So that's the basic point.
That's the basic point. And that's sort of that you get kind of the opposite, from a lot of popular presentations. Like as long as you have a good reason to avoid children, you can do whatever you want. It's all fine. And something doesn't sit right with, I think a lot of faithful couples are like, really? Like, is that like really? And so I'm trying to sort of explain that you're correct, and here's why.
Right. And so before I even read your book, I had developed this sense somehow, I'm not sure why, that the way NFP is often taught is somewhat scandalous because it's taught like as a default. Like everybody should be doing this. I've heard people who are getting married talk about, oh yeah, we're going to start our marriage using NFP. And it's like, okay, well, why not just wait to get married? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
ideally, unless you're just so burning with lust that you're going to commit a mortal sin. Otherwise, like ideally, you wouldn't get married unless you're ready to be ready, so to speak,
Yeah.
to have your at least one child. But people are often doing that in good conscience because they have been sort of taught that this is allowable as kind of like a default approach to marriage. That this is just sort of almost an obligation of like responsible parenting is to be just totally locked into this, like these particular scientific methods of, being aware of when you're fertile and when you're not and stuff. But it can't possibly be any kind of moral obligation because we haven't known about this for more than, a couple centuries. So,
Sure. Yeah.
at
And
least not
you can start
scientifically.
to see the logic between the two questions. The one question is, should we avoid having children right now? Oh, maybe you should for whatever reason. And I talk about an analogy with almsgiving in the book. But then the second question is, should we use relations right now? Those are two different questions. And I think if this podcast is released, when I think it will be, we will be having the USCCB's NFP week.
Oh,
right?
really?
Which, yeah. So
I didn't
this
even
is a
intend. Let me assure the listener that timing of this episode was not intended on any kind of anti-USCCB snark. But
no,
then I
no.
will actually attribute this to divine providence because I didn't plan this.
Yeah.
So, although
But
maybe
like
you planned your book release around this.
I did.
Okay,
I'm
so it's
releasing it
your
on the
fault. All
eve
right.
of USCCB's NFP Awareness Week, and I
Okay.
love the USCCB. Thank you to all of our bishops. It is just to draw attention to the topic in a particular way.
Right.
But if you read the little bit of literature that's there in the early 1900s or a little bit before or whatever, there's a book that I found I allude to in the book from 1944. Everyone's like, this can be suggested with extreme caution, to a couple very privately, only if they're really aware of their necessity, and they've got the right dispositions, and it's for a very, very serious reason. Otherwise it's going to be scandalous, people will be confused, they'll think that you're a Malthusian, whatever. um, Today, we have NFP Awareness Week at a national bishops conference level. Very, very different attitude, right? And so, without saying here which is right or which is wrong, they are different attitudes, and that needs to be explored.
Right. Right. And, so again, before reading your book and getting this kind of particular rigorous treatment of the question and the different motives for the marital act, my gut said, even if you're using NFP, and by using NFP, I mean the sort of the spacing births, the avoiding of intercourse in fertile periods, even if you're doing that legitimately, people should recognize, because of this context that I had, become more aware of in the past couple of years, that it is a venial sin to use marriage purely for pleasure, that setting aside the questions about whether emotional bonding is sort of a separate thing from pleasure, and a legitimate and separate from pleasure, things like that, which you get into in the book as well, setting aside those nuanced questions, it seemed clear that when you're deliberately avoiding the primary end of marriage, which is procreation, it would be very, very easy to start rationalizing and deluding yourself and saying, well, this is emotional bonding and it's legitimate and stuff. Let's say that is legitimate. But when detached from the primary end, my sense was that when this is done habitually, it is apt to sort of slip into the pursuit of mere pleasure, let's say physical pleasure, the primary meaning of that term, surely. And my other thought was that, okay, if you're using NFP for a good reason, and you're not indulging yourself in the use of marriage, because like we said, that's a separate question. Avoiding relations during fertile periods and indulging in them deliberately only during infertile periods are two different questions.
Yes. Very important to distinguish. Sometimes people say, "Oh, NFP," as if it's very clear what they mean, and it's not. You have to make the
Right.
distinctions.
There's different choices involved. And so it struck me that indulgence, people will talk about it, it requires self-restraint, it requires self-denial. That is true. Like, there are certain natural virtues that can be developed with the self-discipline of NFP. However, my concern has also been that it sort of puts way in the background kind of the original idea of self-denial in marriage, marital asceticism. True self-denial, it seems to me, is not denying myself one earthly good so I can have another earthly good. Self-denial is self-denial, full stop, right? And so, again, even just talking about things that are just totally morally permissible, let's say a good use of NFP and a legitimate use of marriage during an infertile periods for good reasons, to satisfy the marriage debt, to avoid, falling into sin due to concupiscence, things like that. You could make an analogy to the self-discipline of like the athlete, right? Who denies himself in certain ways in order to be a faster runner or whatever. Okay, you could say he has to deny himself in some like analogical sense, but that is not Christian self-denial in the spiritual sense. He's doing these things for a worldly good, not a spiritual good. And although, of course, a Christian runner might sort of fold that into a spiritual good in some way. And likewise, NFP, the purpose of
It's
NFP
important what you
is,
just said. It's very important that if it's
yeah,
informed by charity, all things work for good, and it's ultimately meritorious. The self-discipline involved in
right,
these things is a good,
right.
moral, meritorious thing. It's just,
Yes.
yeah, it's for the sake of something else, which is worldly.
That is where we would say the marriage act itself too can be virtuous and
Absolutely.
even
Absolutely. An act of religion, actually. An act of religion.
right, right. Yeah, great, fantastic. But where I was going with that is basically that it with NFP, you are even if very legitimately denying yourself certain pleasures in the moment in order to safeguard other uh worldly goods, maybe very
Yeah.
important ones, health. It'd be physically dangerous for me to have another child. We simply can't afford it. We would be thrown into abject poverty if we had another child.
Yeah.
Those are good reasons, but those are worldly, not in the negative
Yeah.
sense, but simply of this world motivations. Whereas
Right.
if you were doing it for the sake of, a growth in contemplation of God, uh, that wouldn't be NFP. That would just be like a form of fasting, like a form of
Yeah.
continence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So even if it was
Yeah, which
temporary,
is recommended by St. Paul, recommended by, I think it's Pius XII, Sacra Virginitas. I think that's him. And yeah, I mean, look, I'll give you a less edifying example in my own life. Occasionally, Rome has all these sushi restaurants, and they're all you can eat sushi, very, very, very good prices, right? And sometimes, I might skip lunch so that I can have more sushi, at dinner. It's like, well, I'm really hungry now. I denied myself, but it's for the sake of something a little self-indulgent later.
mhm.
And there's a spectrum of self-denial in view of other pleasure. I think I give a slightly rhetorical jab at the end of the book about someone who's dieting in view of looking better on the beach to be maybe looked at a certain way, but then they're calling it fasting. It's like this isn't fasting. You got to be honest with yourself about what things are and what your motivations are, and if it's really done for the love of God. We don't
Yeah.
diet during Lent, we fast. They're different things, even though they look identical.
So yeah, my concern being that like even when NFP and the use of marriage are all done completely above board, completely for the right reasons, there is still a danger in the focusing, especially in the discourse on NFP, that as has in fact happened, the traditional asceticism is ascetical values in marriage are forgotten. And I wouldn't blame that mostly. I wouldn't mostly blame that on NFP, by the way. That's probably more attributable to A, general worldliness, B, just trying to hold the line on the most important issues like we were talking about before. Probably also the attempt to kind of like smooth out the like level the hierarchy between marriage and celibacy or marriage and the priesthood somewhat. I think that has happened, and I think there is a legitimate development in church teaching and various even doctors of the church like Francis de Sales with a more positive view of marriage as a quote unquote vocation, if not in the strict sense, as a path to holiness, right? And I think that's all good, that's all legitimate, but at the same time, sometimes there's kind of like an inferiority complex that happens where we still have to acknowledge the hierarchy. And so
Sure.
some people are kind of threatened by that idea. And so they will want to say, well, it's equally a way to holiness for me to have relations with my wife as it is for a monk to be celibate. And that's a kind
Right.
of a maybe a more modernist strand, but that basic egalitarian tendency is something we all have to deal with, even if we're sort of theologically conservative people. So it might creep in subtle ways there and affect our view of
I
the
agree.
Marriage Act as well.
I agree.
So from there, let's talk a little bit about your discussion of the purpose of the legitimate use of NFP in the primary sense, which is the avoidance of conception.
Right. So that starts with kind of explaining that there is, in general, a duty to have children if you marry. That's sort of the main thing that marriage is for, right? It's the primary end of marriage, and it's the primary end of the sexual act, um, which is a very important element in what marriage is, to such a degree that if you are impotent, you cannot marry, right? Um, and if you don't intend, or rather intend not to have children, that we can go into the canonical technicalities about this, but if you have an intention against children, your marriage is invalid, right? You have to have a certain disposition towards children. They're that important for marriage. Basic point being, you need to try to have kids unless there's some reason that excuses you. And this is for a couple of reasons. First, the community needs children. The human race needs to continue, and the community needs children who are raised by virtuous people into virtuous other people, right? So that's kind of the temporal concern with having more children, and you can see the effects that falling birth rates have in various countries. Won't get into that. The second point, which I think probably should animate much more, this conversation in marriage preparation courses, is that actually you're supposed to raise up saints for God who will worship him forever in heaven. Like that's the main thing that you're trying to do here, is make an offering to God of a soul that he has created, that you have cooperated in sanctifying on earth. And then this immortal soul will worship and praise God forever in heaven. That's the point. Like that's the good stuff, right? That we enjoy in eternity. And you can look at that soul in heaven and say, I helped. And that was, my domestic mission was to raise that child into this glorious, risen individual who's before the face of God in eternity. That's the real high point, right? Um, so that's sort of the positive duty to have children. And there are excusing reasons. And I give a list in the appendix that's taken from this book in 1944 that I found, which is the only serious moral treatment I could find of this whole topic, in a book length format. But basically, you know, if you are going to give alms, you're going to give money away. You're not bound to do this to some particular individual, or else it's an act of justice, right? Um, and so I make an analogy with almsgiving. If you give away so much money that you're going to basically go from one state in the community to another, you're going to drop in your socioeconomic status considerably. Not only do you not have to give those alms, you probably are bound not to, at least under normal circumstances, because you don't know how to live in that way of life. It's not fitting for someone to live in a way that's unbecoming to the way that people are used to interacting with them. Uh, and you can read the classical moralists on almsgiving and giving too much, right? Which you can do. You can give irresponsibly. So uh, I set up this ratio, or this means by which to start to evaluate one's potential motivations for spacing births. That's kind of the way that I'm proposing people think about it. Is, if I'm going to give alms and these are my alms, what would it do to me? And keeping in mind socioeconomic status and fundamental way of life. I give a few examples in the book, and maybe you can think of more, but obviously the popes talk about some categories, and I'm trying to sort of articulate that a little bit more. Yeah, and it can get very complicated, and I have sort of, I think, a TLDR synthesis, at the end of one of the sections. Um, and I want to stress that, people make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes in moral decisions. And we're talking here primarily about venial sin, and even very light venial sin. And guess what? That's part of daily life. We have a loving God who wants to forgive us. And, you don't even have to go to confession for venial sin. You can just say, Lord, I'm sorry. You can receive Holy Communion, and so on. So just to kind of lower the temperature a little bit,
Sure.
where the stakes are a little bit lower in this regard. Though I do talk
Right.
about, the grave duty over a certain period of time. That's its own conversation. Um,
Right. Well, so I mean, the area where the stakes of venial sin get higher is when you are justifying it, or kind of engaging in it habitually and in an indifferent manner. That's where
yeah,
it
for
really
years and years
cripples
and
you.
years.
Where
Yeah,
it cripples you spiritually. I can speak from
yeah.
experience here. And it keeps you from really bearing fruit of holiness. So venial sin in that sense is quite significant, but not in the sense of you kind of make a one-off mistake out of weakness,
Right.
out of ignorance, those kinds of things. So it's not something to be neurotic about, but it's something not to
No.
justify as a habitual practice either.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just kind of, you calm down and you say, I really want to try to do the good, and I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to train myself in virtue more and more. And over time, you start to make better moral judgments naturally because as you become more virtuous, the virtues are connected. You learn more about the good. It's kind of, in your nature. You build a taste for what's good, and yeah, over time it becomes easier to make the right choice about these things intuitively, more or less.
But this is where I think having a specific examination of this is helpful, because I think part of the stress around NFP is not knowing, because the church's official statements have been fairly vague about what constitute good reasons to avoid having
Yes.
children. So that even if somebody might disagree with one particular detail of what's justified, what's not, or proportionality, things like that, just having kind of like a schema to look at, I think will relieve people. Sometimes for some people, it won't be, I'm worried about whether this is too strict, so much as I'm stressed out because I don't have guidance. I feel like
Yeah.
everything's a gray area.
Yeah.
So I think that is actually I think that section of your book, I actually don't think, for some people who truly being selfish in their marriage and not having, kids for frivolous reasons, I think it'll be challenging. I think that section of your book will be less challenging than the sort of the direct sexual ethics
Yeah.
parts, actually. Should we talk more about the marital debt, or should we talk more about solam, voluptatem?
Yeah, the solam voluptatem stuff is really into the weeds, and I make an attempt to kind of, take a weed whacker to it a bit. That could be a book of its own, just sifting through the literature, all of the authors. I mean, briefly, if I'm remembering correctly, the French bishops were really pushing Innocent the Eleventh to condemn this proposition, and then he condemns it, and then the Spanish theologians, they sort of they said, well, what do you mean pleasure alone? Well, what about this and what about that, and does this count? And they sort of found all these loopholes. I'm trying to propose a fair way of reading that condemnation for marital debt. This is something that a lot of people just are uncomfortable with as a basic idea. I think they really just kind of need to get over that. Like, maybe you didn't really understand what marriage meant, and like, hey, it's right there in First Corinthians. It's right there in the entire tradition. It's right there in the very logic of what marriage is. So just kind of swallow that pill. This is a real thing, but it also has a reasonable dynamic to it. Just to
Yeah, what's
use
the
the
spirit? What's the
imperative
spirit in which
mood.
we should discuss this?
Yeah, I mean, a spirit of being adults, like for a husband to use the imperative mood in a suggestion about having relations does not necessarily mean a strict appeal to his rights as a husband, and you get this kind of ham-fisted treatment by some speakers. I won't name names, but one in particular really just says, no, every request must be fulfilled immediately. That's it. And if you don't agree with that, you don't understand. This is like, it's just not a human way of understanding communication. And also, you would presume that your spouse actually cares about your own needs as well. It's like, no, honey, I have a headache. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't know. Like, that's fine. Okay, all right. Well, there you go. That's fine. But to just kind of, you know, uh, cartoonize this issue is not a good thing. There is the baseline fundamental obligation, but normally in the dynamics of human communication, we're talking about something not reaching that point. And then on the other side, there's when can you refuse it? And that's its own whole extended casuistic analysis. Like, obviously, if it's going to be deadly, that's one thing. But Thomas gives the example of leprosy, right? That's an example I have in a footnote. He thinks leprosy does not excuse one from paying the debt. I think one of the authors that Saint Alphonsus quotes a lot. It's not Bonacina, but it's one of the other ones. He thinks leprosy does excuse. So I don't think leprosy is a big concern among your audience, but there could be some excuses that do give one the right to say no, um, health or other special motivations.
Right. And to kind of express that you don't really want to is not the same as refusal either.
Right,
It's called
right.
communication. So
Yeah, yeah. It's called
so a
being an adult.
husband, and traditionally, now we assume it's the husband who's requesting and the wife who's denying, but that may not necessarily be the case. And I think in the past, people didn't make those same assumptions about which
They
spouse
did
was going to
not.
be more sexually voracious. Um, but that's communication. If somebody says I don't feel well, I really don't feel like it, then that gives the in charity, it can be something you might want to keep to yourself, but it also in charity can be a way of allowing your spouse to kind of like to know where you're at, and because your spouse wouldn't want to, if he's a charitable person, wouldn't want to do something that you
Right.
don't want to do, or
Yeah, maybe you just get the hint. You're like, oh, okay, so okay, I'm just going to leave it alone. And you got to be fair about it. It's like if you keep doing that over months and months and months and months,
right,
then you're the problem. So, oh, my
right,
head hurts. Well, no, now you're the
right.
problem. It's not that it's just communication. It's that you're being selfish or you're refusing to
Yeah,
talk about the thing that's really going on. And now
yeah. I
you
mean,
need
giving
to
your
do that
spouse the
because,
cold shoulder is a sin.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
a sin. I think a lot of people don't want to hear that because I don't know. There's like a feminism aspect too sometimes to it, but
yes, people feel used.
you have a nice short article on your website about the marital debt and kind of like the nitty gritty of like how it breaks down in terms of obligation. That I'll link to that. But my impression of how it comes out in the book is not, it's not so much in the aspect that's generally discussed. What's generally discussed is the question of obligation and the idea that like
Right.
my spouse is entitled to my body and things like that. That's not really the emphasis in the book. The impression I got in reading your book is that the marital debt as a category is essential to understanding the ethics of marriage.
Absolutely.
So I bring that up to say that I think some people want to push this to the side, much like the question of obedience. Like people want to kind of push that to the side and say, well, that's kind of weird. Why are you even bringing that up? Or like, how is that if the spouses are both charitable, then like it doesn't matter. We don't even need to talk about this. But like actually, you still need to have it as a conceptual category, even if the spouses are like just totally in sync. Because it's part of the moral reasoning about the act and the
Yeah.
justification of the act.
Yeah, and canonical, there are canonical implications as well. Like if it's right there, I don't remember the number of the canon, 1159 maybe. It's still, this is real. If your spouse commits adultery and it's, demonstrable, you do not need to pay the debt anymore. They're seeking goods somewhere else, and the principle is they're on their own unless you readmit them to conjugal life. And there's, you can read about that in St. Thomas. He's using the jurisprudence and law of his own day, but we have our own. That canon is real. And impotence is also relevant. Like if you can't pay the debt, you cannot do the thing that is justly owed to your spouse. So if you're impotent upon contracting marriage, have a permanent impotence, it's not a marriage.
Right, right, right. Um, this is a sort of a tangent, but I feel like I've read in some early authors' remarks to the effect that, in fact, if your spouse is unfaithful, you would be somehow participating in their sin if you continued to have relations with them. Do you know if that's definitely the case? And if so, what's the kind of reasoning behind that? I feel like I've read some early church fathers or somebody say you are like sort of making yourself a party to this if you're sort of virtually sharing a bed with the prostitute or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. If they're habitually seeking relations elsewhere and you don't really seem to have a big deal with it, then yeah, you're sort of, yeah, your spouse now has a concubine, and if you're not resisting that, then yeah, you're giving a kind of tacit approval, or
Mm,
implicit approval or whatever. I could see that being a reasonable position to have.
I see. Okay. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that you get into the book about these questions. The question of what it means to talk about marriage, the use of marriage purely for pleasure being forbidden, for instance. That obviously takes some discussion. I wanted to talk about the big picture spiritually. You already talked about that. We talked about the stakes, the spiritual stakes of the conversation a bit at the beginning. You have a wonderful closing chapter kind of on the pastoral application as well. What about people who are just kind of stressed out even hearing about all this and kind of feel like this is going to take the joy out of my marriage because I have to be constantly thinking about like justifying each individual, time I have relations with my spouse, things like that. Like how do people sort of take this stuff in seriously but avoid scrupulosity, overthinking it, neurosis, a lack of proper spontaneity, all those things?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to make sure, your prayer and your frequenting of the sacraments is kind of up to snuff. Without grace, it's not going to go well. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that you actually are engaging in healthy communication with your spouse. Because maybe there's stuff going on in your marriage that you aren't even aware of, right?
Hmm.
And that could help. That could help. Like maybe they're just dying for more kids, like right now, all the time. It's all they've been able to think about, and they haven't said that. And so now that's sort of, it's like, all right, I guess we're trying to have kids now. Then most of the considerations, about this out the window, right? It's like, great, we have a virtual intention towards children. Now we can just be very spontaneous, whenever, because like we're trying to have kids.
Oh yeah, can you
Um,
quickly explain virtual intention? I think that's a useful thing to have in mind as
Sure.
well.
Yes, there's all kinds of distinctions you can make with intention. One of the most important ones, which I use in the book quite a bit, including a pretty extended discussion on the difference between contraception and NFP. An actual intention, the way I'm using the language is, I am thinking of this right now in the act. I want this thing from the act, right? Whereas a virtual intention, as Father John Hardin, S.J. of happy memory, uh, defines it, it's an intention that you made previously, like well before the act, which is now informing your act because you haven't at least contradicted it, or you're not explicitly acting against that intention. So it's like, if you marry and you're like, yeah, we want to have kids, and you don't really think about that, for a little while, well, that intention towards children is now informing your acts. Much the same way, father gets vested in the sacristy. He's like, all right, I got to go say the mass now. And he walks out, and he may not have has coffee or whatever, and he's not really thinking about what he's doing, but he says all the right words, uses all the right matter. It's like, well, he had a virtual intention towards celebrating mass. That suffices,
Like when
right?
you're distracted involuntarily and saying the rosary, you're still saying the rosary.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So that's important. Um,
Sorry, but anyway,
and
go on about your sort of spiritual considerations there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, then I would also say, you have to be honest with yourself. Do I want to be chaste? Do you really, do you really want to pursue the virtue of chastity? And,
As
you
opposed to
know,
just avoiding mortal sin or
yeah,
something
as
like that.
opposed to just like, eking into heaven, like, do I actually want to do what pleases God? And this is a lifetime battle. Turns out if we all really wanted that, we'd all be saints right now. So this is a lifetime thing. And so I think also being realistic about that element as well, is a lot of times, the scrupulous will sort of actually have a secret pride, which is animating their frustrations. Like, I should be perfect already. It's like, but that's not how Christian life typically is. So to be patient with yourself, because you are a sinner and you're going to fall repeatedly, but just knowing that you can get back up and keep moving, that's important. And then just growing in virtue in general. Like I said, you'll develop a taste for the good over time because all the virtues are connected. And if you're just paying a little bit more attention over time to the motivations you have for things, and you just think about these things, not to the point where you're leading yourself into worse things, but just in a natural and organic way. Maybe as part of a daily examine, that would be a good place to start.
And what can married couples look forward to as they sort of grow spiritually in this process in terms of the growth of their marriage and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna discover a whole other dimension of yourself, probably, right? Whole other dimension of your marriage. Yeah, your spouse may have other things going on in their minds that they haven't kind of brought up in your relationship. You might really get to focus more on prayer, maybe on the apostolate in some way. You might be able to pay more attention to your children that you already have, and uh, be able to perceive their spiritual needs better or differently. Those are some things, and I talk in the book a little bit about the gifts, and all of that kind of stuff would go along with
The gifts of the Holy
more
Spirit.
periodic continence. Yeah, and then maybe most significantly is if and when, especially women will have serious health issues that might make pregnancy very dangerous, right? If that were to befall a couple, well, you're sort of trained for that. You've disciplined yourself, you've freed yourself enough from, an attachment to venial sin. Like you can now deal with this heavy cross much better. So that would be another consideration.
How do you think all of this traditional doctrine should inform the church's marriage education and their teaching of NFP, or not teaching it, or teaching it only under certain circumstances? Like how would you suggest that this be applied pastorally?
Yeah, it's going to depend a lot on the culture. I have a lot of friends who are West African, East African clergy. This is not necessarily the issue, in these places. There, it's more like, well, I already have six wives, or no, I saw the witch doctor, and like, my wife is now impotent, things like this, or whatever, or infertile. This is a big thing. It's like, what is my country's issues? What is my parish's issues? Or what are the issues there? That that's a big consideration before you get into the actual application of this. But in general, I would say probably most couples. I'm going to be careful here. Pace USCCB probably not pushing the charts and methods and all of this, and you got to go see a dedicated instructor as part of a marriage preparation course. Probably I would say not to do that in most contexts in America, um, because you're already sort of you know telling couples like, no, 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 like kids are kind of scary, like you may not want to have many. It's like, probably we should focus on the good first and really convince couples that kids are a great thing and you should have them. And like you could use infertile periods, if you need to, but like sex is not just for fun, and we really want to focus on having kids and just bring it right back to kids. Kids are a great thing. You can raise them to be saints, and how cool is that? And that's your vocation as spouses, is to make saints for God forever in heaven. I think orienting the conversation around that ultimate eternal goal is probably a much better approach than saying, here's the Ogino-Knaus method. That's just my thought.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that for a while NFP was, and still sometimes is, pushed as like, this is the answer. This is the answer to our cultural conflict over contraception. Like, hey guys, relax. Like, it's all good. We've got NFP and this like solves the problem, right?
Right.
And now actually you've got an increasing number of people speaking out and writing about like what a pain they find NFP to be.
Yeah.
How it's not working for them, or it's just very frustrating. It actually adds stress and conflict to their marriage.
Paranoia. Yep. Big time.
And so that's not to be underrated too, is that the fact that like, okay, you're either going to be like thinking more carefully about your use of marriage, or you're going to be thinking like more about all this like scientific stuff that you have to keep track of all the time. Like NFP is not just enabling people to relax either.
No, no,
So,
you might feel like
um,
you're in one of those pods in the Matrix. Like I got all these things, I'm measuring everything and like what's going on, and this doesn't feel human. And I mean, there's something to that. And definitely, the neurosis over fertility is psychologically unhealthy, and even for some people might be crippling. And in that case, the solution is self-discipline. Just just kind of, chill with conjugal acts, and if your spouse is really aggressive, you need to have a serious conversation and say, honey, this is really a problem for me, and I'm asking you to help me, and start the conversation there.
anything else you want to talk about on this topic before we finish up?
Yeah, I want to make sure that it's clear that I understand how difficult this topic can be for couples, and also for people preparing couples for marriage. I don't mean to minimize the psychological or moral struggles that people have. It's mostly about indicating where the moral lines are that need to be pursued in the complicated, thorny mess that moral life and marriage, are.
Great, 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 great. Before we go, any other projects you want to talk about?
So I'll point to one. I'm very involved in fundraising for mission healthcare apostolates. This is a thing that I do with my free time, and I specifically do this through endurance athletics feats. So last year, I ran from Rome to Assisi. It's 100 miles. I was awake for 45 hours. Um, and this coming November, I'll have a similar stunt. I'll be running from Rome to Bologna. It's 260 miles, a little bit of sleep, but kind of in the back of the SUV or whatever. And that's in connection with a hospital that we're trying to build in connection with the Dominicans in Lagos. So if you follow me on X or wherever, you'll be hearing about that.
Right,
So
that's in Nigeria, right?
yeah, Nigeria. Yeah,
Great, awesome, awesome. So, yeah, you'll give me any links I can put in the show notes for that, I assume.
absolutely. And then in December, kind of in connection with the NFP book, I'll be launching a dedicated website to marriage issues, some scholarly resources, historical stuff, a high level blog, for law, culture, psychology, history, this kind of stuff. And then also some articles and things like, like the book. The book will be there.
Great. And so people can, am I right? People will be able to buy a physical copy of the book if they wish, but they can also get it for free as a PDF from your website.
I'm
That
hoping
right?
to put a physical copy out there at some point, um, just self-publish on Amazon. But I really want this work to be available to anyone who wants it for free. So it's a free ebook, and if and when there's a physical copy, it won't be free, but it's the same content is available for free through my website.
Well, Eamon, thank you so much for writing this book. It's been fascinating, and I'm single myself, but it's given me a lot to think about in terms of like, okay, if I am wanting to get married, and like, okay, so what am I looking for in marriage to like purify my expectations, my motivations, all of those things. It's like it's good to know what you're getting into. Marriage is, it's not supposed to be a cakewalk where we just enjoy earthly goods.
No, it's not a playground for erotic emotions and these things. It's about sanctifying yourself and your spouse and raising saints for God.
Right. Awesome. Eamon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.